The telegram arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, its urgent words cutting through the autumn gloom like a blade through silk. Detective Marcus Blackwood set down his brandy and adjusted his reading glasses, the amber liquid forgotten as he absorbed the cryptic message from Inspector Carter. Mysterious death at Ashford Manor. Your expertise required immediately. Circumstances. Most peculiar. Eleanor Hayes looked up from her meticulous filing, her keen eyes catching the subtle change in her employer's demeanor. Another case, Mr. Blackwood? Indeed, my dear Eleanor. Pack our bags. We're bound for the Hamptons. Blackwood's voice carried that familiar note of intrigue that preceded their most challenging investigations. It seems the wealthy have once again provided us with a most interesting puzzle. The journey to Ashford Manor took them through winding roads lined with ancient oaks, their branches creating a cathedral of shadows in the dying light. The estate loomed before them like something from a Gothic novel, all towering spires and ivy-covered walls, windows that seemed to watch their approach with hollow, knowing eyes. Inspector Carter met them at the imposing front entrance, his usually composed face etched with concern. Blackwood, thank God you're here. This case has everyone baffled. The circumstances, Carter? Blackwood stepped from the car, his sharp eyes already cataloging details, the perfectly manicured grounds, the subtle signs of recent activity, the way the household staff lingered nervously in doorways. Vincent Ashford, 62, found dead in his private study this morning. Locked from the inside, windows sealed, no sign of forced entry. The man appeared to have died of natural causes, yet ... Clatter. Clatter paused, running a hand through his graying hair. There's something wrong about the whole scene. Something that doesn't add up. Eleanor gathered her notebook and pen, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had learned to trust those inexplicable feelings that preceded their most complex cases, the sense that reality was somehow askew, that truth lay buried beneath layers of careful deception. Who discovered the body? Blackwood inquired as they approached the manor's entrance, its oak doors heavy with the weight of secrets. Double quotes, Mrs. Margaret Ashford, his wife. She'd been concerned when he didn't come down for breakfast. Vincent was apparently obsessive about his morning routine. Carter led them through a marble foyer that echoed with whispered conversations and hushed sobs. The family gathered here for a weekend auction, rare artifacts from Ashford's private collection. Quite valuable, from what I understand. The study where Vincent Ashford met his end was a testament to refined taste and scholarly pursuits. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that had witnessed decades of secrets. An enormous mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and it was here that the master of Ashford Manor had been discovered. Slumped forward as if he had simply fallen asleep while working, but Blackwood's trained eyes saw what others missed. The subtle disarray of papers that suggested someone had searched through them. The faint chemical scent that lingered despite the room's ventilation. The way certain objects seemed positioned too precisely, as if someone had taken great care to arrange a scene. Tell me about the household, Eleanor said, her pen poised over her notebook. She had learned that the most innocuous details often prove crucial in unraveling these elaborate deceptions. Carter consulted his notes. Mrs. Margaret Ashford, the widow, 58, married to Vincent for 35 years. Their son David, 32, works in the family business. Vincent's brother Thomas, 60, who's apparently been estranged from the family for years but showed up for the auction. Dr. Helena Morrison, 45, Vincent's personal physician and old family friend. And James Crawford, 55, Vincent's business partner and executor of his estate. Quite a gathering. Blackwood murmured, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk where Vincent had been found. And each with their own reasons for being here? No doubt. The detective's examination of the study revealed several puzzling elements. A half-finished letter lay on the desk, the ink still wet when Vincent was discovered, yet the handwriting showed no signs of distress or hurry. A valuable Ming vase sat slightly askew on its usual shelf, and the room's Persian rug bore the faint impression of something heavy having been moved across it recently. Eleanor interviewed Mrs. Ashford first, finding the widow to be a woman of steely composure despite her obvious grief. Vincent had been working late these past few weeks, Margaret explained, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Something was troubling him about the business, though he wouldn't discuss it with me. He could be quite secretive about his affairs. Did he have any enemies, Mrs. Ashford? Eleanor asked gently. Margaret's laugh held no warmth. In Vincent's line of work, rare artifacts and antiquities, one makes competitors rather than enemies. Though I suppose the distinction can become rather blurred when millions of dollars are at stake. David Ashford painted a different picture of his father. The younger man paced the library like a caged animal, his expensive suit wrinkled from a sleepless night. Father had been acting strangely for weeks. Paranoid almost. He kept checking logs, looking over his shoulder. Said he thought someone was watching him. Did he specify who might be watching him? Blackwood inquired. No, but he'd become obsessed with the idea that someone was trying to steal from him. Not just his artifacts, but something more personal. He kept muttering about protecting what's rightfully mine and making sure the truth doesn't die with me. Thomas Ashford proved to be the most intriguing interview subject. The estranged brother sat in the Manor's conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants that seemed to mirror his own carefully cultivated mystique. Vincent and I hadn't spoken in 15 years, he admitted without apparent emotion. Not since our father's will was read. Vincent got everything, you see? The manor, the business, the collection. I was left with virtually nothing, yet you came for the auction. Eleanor observed. Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Curiosity, my dear. I wanted to see what my dear brother had done with our family legacy. And perhaps I hoped we might reconcile before it was too late. Dr. Helena Morrison provided medical insights that only deepened the mystery. Vincent's health had been excellent for a man his age. No history of heart problems, blood pressure well controlled, no signs of any condition that might cause sudden death. The preliminary examination suggests cardiac arrest, but there are certain ... inconsistencies. What sort of inconsistencies? Blackwood pressed. The positioning of the body, for one. When someone suffers a massive heart attack, they typically clutch at their chest, perhaps call for help. Vincent appeared to have simply laid his head down on his desk, as if he'd grown suddenly tired. It's possible, of course, but unusual. James Crawford, the business partner, seemed the most shaken by Vincent's death. He sat in the study where his friend had died, staring at the desk as if it might reveal its secrets. Vincent called me 3 days ago, said he needed to discuss something important. Something about the business that he discovered. We were supposed to meet after the auction. Did he give you any indication of what he'd discovered? Blackwood asked. Crawford shook his head. Only that it involved someone close to him. Someone he trusted. He sounded betrayed, if that makes sense. As if he'd learned something that fundamentally changed how he viewed the world. As evening approached, Blackwood gathered his observations while Eleanor compiled her notes. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to emerge, but the picture they formed was far from clear. Someone in the Ashford household was harboring deadly secrets, and Vincent's death was merely the visible tip of a much darker iceberg. What troubles me most, Blackwood confided to Eleanor as they reviewed their findings, is the careful staging of this scene. Someone wanted Vincent's death to appear natural, yet they couldn't resist leaving subtle clues that something was amiss. It suggests either remarkable arrogance or a desire to be discovered. Eleanor looked up from her notes. Or perhaps someone wanted to direct suspicion toward a particular person while concealing their own involvement. Precisely. We're dealing with a mind that operates on multiple levels, one that plans not just the crime, but also its investigation. That makes our adversary exceptionally dangerous. The first night at Ashford Manor passed fitfully. The household remained on edge, each member dealing with grief and suspicion in their own way. But as dawn broke over the estate's manicured grounds, it became clear that Vincent's death was merely the opening move in a far more complex game. Eleanor discovered the first additional clue while examining Vincent's private correspondence. Hidden in a leather portfolio was a series of letters dating back several months, all bearing the same urgent tone. Someone had been threatening Vincent, demanding he return what was stolen or face consequences beyond imagination. The letters were unsigned, but they revealed a pattern of escalating demands. The writer claimed to have evidence of Vincent's involvement in some past wrongdoing, something that could destroy both his reputation and his family's legacy. The final letter, dated just 1 week before Vincent's death, contained a chilling ultimatum. You have 7 days to make this right. After that, the choice will be taken from you. Blackwood studied the letters with growing fascination. The paper was expensive, the handwriting educated but disguised. Most tellingly, certain phrases suggested the writer had intimate knowledge of the Ashford family's private affairs. This wasn't the work of an outside blackmailer, but someone within Vincent's inner circle. The auction provides perfect cover, Eleanor observed. With so many people in the house, anyone could have accessed Vincent's study without arousing suspicion. Indeed. But our killer made one crucial error. Blackwood held up the final threat letter. They assumed Vincent would submit to their demands. Instead, he chose to fight back. The question is, what was Vincent planning to reveal that made his death necessary? The answer began to emerge when Inspector Carter received the forensic report on Vincent's study. Traces of a rare plant extract had been found on the desk blotter, aconitine derived from wolfsbane. In small doses, it could simulate the symptoms of a heart attack while leaving few traces in the bloodstream. Wolfsbane, Dr. Morrison confirmed when questioned, also known as monkshood. Highly toxic, but it requires considerable botanical knowledge to extract and concentrate the active compounds. This wasn't a crime of passion, detective. Someone planned this murder with meticulous care. Blackwood's investigation took on new urgency as he realized they were dealing with a sophisticated killer who had used advanced knowledge of toxicology to commit what appeared to be the perfect murder. But every perfect crime contained the seeds of its own destruction, and he was determined to find them. The breakthrough came when Eleanor discovered Vincent's hidden safe behind a painting in his study. Inside, along with various valuable documents, was a leather journal containing Vincent's private thoughts over the past several months. The entries revealed a man growing increasingly paranoid and fearful, but also one determined to uncover a terrible truth. The journal's final entries were particularly revealing. I know who's been stealing from the collection. The evidence is undeniable, but the betrayal cuts deeper than I could have imagined. How long has this been going on? How many pieces have disappeared while I trusted blindly? Confronted them today. They denied everything, but I could see the guilt in their eyes. They begged for another chance, promised to make restitution. But how can I trust again after such a violation? They're threatening me now. Say they'll destroy everything I've built if I expose them. Don't they understand that some things are more important than reputation? The collection must be preserved, the truth must be protected. The final entry, written the night before Vincent's death, was the most chilling. I've made my decision. Tomorrow, after the auction, I'll reveal everything. Let them try to stop me. Some secrets are dangerous to keep buried. As Blackwood read these words aloud to Eleanor and Inspector Carter, the magnitude of their case became clear. Vincent Ashford hadn't died of natural causes or even from a simple poisoning. He'd been murdered to prevent him from exposing a theft ring that had been systematically looting his priceless collection, a ring operated by someone he trusted implicitly, but who among the assembled suspects had both the knowledge to extract aconitine from wolfsbane and access to Vincent's private study? Who had been stealing from the collection, and how had Vincent discovered their identity? The answers to these questions would determine not only the identity of Vincent's killer, but also the fate of everyone gathered at Ashford Manor. As the first part of their investigation drew to a close, Blackwood knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of the case. Someone in the house was desperate enough to kill to protect their secrets. And as the detective would soon learn, Vincent's death was only the beginning of their murderous plan. Asterisk. The second day at Ashford Manor dawned with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down upon the estate like a physical weight. Detective Blackwood stood at his bedroom window, watching the morning mist roll across the manicured grounds, his mind working through the intricate web of evidence they had uncovered. Vincent Ashford's death was no longer a mystery. Of method, the aconitine poisoning was clear, but the identity of his killer remained. Frustratingly elusive, Eleanor joined him for breakfast in the Manor's formal dining room, where the surviving members of the household picked at their food with the distracted air of people whose worlds had been fundamentally altered overnight. The auction of Vincent's artifacts, originally scheduled for that afternoon, had been postponed indefinitely, leaving everyone trapped in a state of suspended animation. "I've been thinking about the journal entries," Eleanor said quietly, spreading marmalade on her toast with mechanical precision. Vincent wrote about confronting the thief, about them begging for another chance. That suggests someone he cared about, someone whose betrayal truly wounded him. Blackwood nodded, his sharp eyes observing the breakfast table's occupants. Margaret Ashford sat rigid in her chair, her composure as perfectly maintained as her silver hair. David paced near the windows, unable to sit still, while Thomas remained conspicuously absent from the morning meal. Dr. Morrison engaged in quiet conversation with James Crawford, both of them speaking in the hushed tones reserved for funeral parlors and crime scenes. "The question that troubles me most," Blackwood murmured, "is timing. Why did Vincent choose to confront his thief now? What changed in recent weeks to make him suspicious after what might have been months, or even years of systematic theft?" The answer began to emerge when Inspector Carter arrived with additional forensic reports and a revelation that cast the entire case in a new light. "The blood work came back," he announced, his expression grim. "Vincent definitely died from aconitine poisoning, but there's something else. We found traces of a mild sedative in his system, something that would have made him drowsy, less alert than usual." "A sedative?" Eleanor looked up sharply from her notebook. "That would explain the positioning of the body. He wasn't overcome by sudden cardiac arrest. He was gradually incapacitated and then administered the fatal dose." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. "Which means our killer needed time to prepare their poison and ensure Vincent would be helpless to resist. This was planned with extraordinary precision, but Carter's most significant revelation was yet to come. We've also completed the preliminary inventory of Vincent's collection. According to the insurance documentation, at least a dozen major pieces are missing, items worth well over $2 million. The thefts appear to have been carefully spread out over time, replacing originals with high-quality forgeries. The magnitude of the theft ring became clear as they examined Vincent's meticulous cataloging system. Someone with intimate knowledge of his collection had been systematically looting it, selecting pieces that wouldn't be immediately missed and replacing them with fakes so sophisticated they had fooled even Vincent's trained eye until recently. But what made him suspicious? Eleanor wondered aloud as they stood in the manor's private gallery, surrounded by priceless artifacts that might or might not be authentic. What changed that caused him to look more closely at his collection? The answer came from an unexpected source, the manor's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, who had served the Ashford family for over 30 years. The elderly woman approached them hesitantly, wringing her hands with nervous energy. "I probably shouldn't say anything," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but Mr. Vincent had been acting strange these past weeks. He had taken to examining his artifacts with a magnifying glass, muttering about inconsistencies and subtle differences. He even brought in an outside appraiser without telling anyone in the family. An outside appraiser? Blackwood's interest was immediately piqued. "Do you know who?" Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Dr. Sarah Chun from the Metropolitan Museum. She came twice, both times when the family was away. Mr. Vincent swore me to secrecy, said it was a delicate matter that required discretion." This revelation sent Eleanor to the telephone immediately. Dr. Chun reached at her office in New York, confirmed Mrs. Patterson's story, and provided details that fundamentally altered their understanding of the case. Vincent suspected someone was replacing pieces in his collection with forgeries. Dr. Chun explained. He'd noticed subtle differences in several items, variations in patina, slight discrepancies in craftsmanship that suggested modern reproduction techniques. My analysis confirmed his fears. At least 15 pieces I examined were sophisticated fakes, probably created within the last 5 years. Did he indicate who he suspected? Eleanor asked, not directly, but he mentioned being betrayed by someone with the expertise to fool even him. He was particularly concerned about items from his Asian antiquities collection. Apparently that was someone's specialty area. As Eleanor relayed this conversation to Blackwood, both detectives realized they had uncovered the motive for Vincent's murder. Someone with deep knowledge of Asian antiquities had been systematically replacing his collection with forgeries, selling the originals, and pocketing millions of dollars over several years. When Vincent discovered the deception, the thief had turned to murder to protect their secret. But which of their suspects had the necessary expertise? The answer seemed to point in several directions simultaneously, creating a web of suspicion that encompassed nearly everyone. Ashford Manor. Dr. Helena Morrison, they discovered, had spent several years in China, studying traditional medicine, and had developed considerable knowledge of Asian art during her travels. Her medical background would certainly provide the knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate aconitine from wolfsbane plants. Thomas Ashford, despite his estrangement from the family, had earned a doctorate in art history with a focus on Asian antiquities. His 15-year absence from Vincent's life would have provided perfect cover for establishing the connections necessary to fence stolen artwork on the international market. Even James Crawford proved to have unexpected qualifications. His business partnership with Vincent had begun 20 years earlier when he'd helped establish connections with Asian art dealers. He had the knowledge, the connections, and most importantly, the access necessary to systematically loot Vincent's collection. But as Blackwood delved deeper into the case, he began to notice inconsistencies that suggested the truth was far more complex than a simple theft operation. The threatening letters, for instance, contained references that seemed designed to misdirect suspicion. Certain phrases appeared calculated to implicate Thomas Ashford, while others pointed toward business rivalries that might involve James Crawford, someone as playing a very sophisticated game. Blackwood confided to Eleanor as they examined the letters once again. These aren't genuine threats from a desperate thief. They're carefully crafted misdirection designed to implicate specific individuals while concealing the real perpetrator's identity. Eleanor studied the handwriting samples they had collected from each suspect, comparing them to the threatening letters. The disguised handwriting makes definitive analysis difficult, but there are certain consistent features, the way certain letters are formed, the pressure of the pen strokes. Whoever wrote these is highly intelligent and has been planning this deception for a considerable time. Their investigation took an unexpected turn when they discovered Vincent's safety deposit box at the local bank. Inside, along with important family documents, was a sealed envelope marked to be opened only in the event of my death. The contents proved to be Vincent's insurance policy against his killer, detailed photographs of the forged artifacts, copies of his correspondence with Dr. Chan, and most damning of all, a recording he had made of his confrontation with the thief. But when they played the recording, Vincent's voice was clear while his adversary remained frustratingly inaudible, speaking in whispers that the recording device couldn't capture. They could hear Vincent's words. "How could you do this to me? After everything I've done for you, after all the trust I placed in you?" But the response was nothing more than indistinct murmurs. However, certain phrases in Vincent's side of the conversation provided crucial clues about his killer's identity. "I know about the gallery connections," he said at one point. "I know how you've been selling my pieces through intermediaries. Did you really think I wouldn't eventually notice?" Later, the irony is that I was going to change my will anyway. "You could have waited, but greed made you impatient." These revelations suggested that Vincent's killer stood to inherit from his estate, providing both motive for the thefts and urgency for his murder. But the will reading, scheduled for the following day, would reveal the specific beneficiaries and potentially expose the killer's identity. As the second day wore on, Blackwood noticed increasing tension among the household members. David Ashford had grown more agitated, spending hours on urgent telephone calls that he refused to discuss. Margaret maintained her icy composure, but Eleanor observed her carefully examining various artifacts throughout the manor, as if reassessing their authenticity. Thomas had emerged from his self-imposed isolation to wander the galleries. With the air of someone conducting an inventory. Dr. Morrison seemed particularly nervous, starting at sudden sounds and avoiding prolonged conversations with the detectives. When pressed about her knowledge of Asian art, she became defensive, claiming her expertise was purely amateur and hardly sufficient for the kind of sophisticated forgeries you're describing. James Crawford presented perhaps the most puzzling behavior. He seemed genuinely grief-stricken by Vincent's death, yet there were moments when Eleanor caught him studying the other suspects with calculating eyes, as if he were conducting his own investigation into the murder. Day's most significant breakthrough came when Eleanor discovered additional evidence hidden in Vincent's private study. Behind a loose panel in the oak wainscoting, she found a small collection of items that Vincent had apparently been using to track the theft of his collection. Photographs of original artifacts taken before the thefts, detailed notes about suspicious changes he had observed, and most importantly, a list of dates corresponding to occasions when certain suspects had been alone in the house with access to the collection. The pattern that emerged was both illuminating and disturbing. The thefts had accelerated significantly over the past year, suggesting either increased desperation on the part of the thief or the influence of external pressures. Moreover, the specific items chosen for theft showed intimate knowledge not just of their value, but of Vincent's emotional attachment to them. This wasn't random burglary. It was calculated psychological warfare. Whoever is doing this knew exactly how to hurt Vincent most deeply. Eleanor observed as they studied the evidence. They chose pieces with sentimental value, items connected to his father's legacy and his own collecting adventures. This theft was personal, Blackwood nodded grimly, which narrows our suspect list considerably. We're looking for someone who knew Vincent intimately, someone who understood not just the monetary value of his collection, but its emotional significance to him and his family. As evening approached, The household gathered for dinner with the oppressive atmosphere of people trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else, searching for signs of guilt or deception. The killer was among them, Blackwood knew, probably enjoying the psychological drama they had created, but the detective was also aware that their investigation was approaching a critical juncture. Vincent's will would be read the following morning, potentially exposing the killer's motive. More importantly, their own inquiries were making the murderer nervous. Someone who had killed once to protect their secrets wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they felt threatened. Thought that had been nagging at Blackwood throughout the day finally crystallized as he observed the dinner conversation. The killer wasn't just someone who had stolen from Vincent's collection. They were someone who had fundamentally betrayed his trust in the most personal way possible. The rage and hurt evident in Vincent's journal entries suggested a betrayal that cut to the very core of his being. As the evening progressed, Blackwood began to see the subtle signs that indicated their killer was preparing for the next phase of their plan. Someone at Ashford Manor was getting desperate, and desperate killers were the most dangerous opponents of all. The stage was set for the final confrontation, but first, Vincent's will would reveal the ultimate motive for his murder and potentially identify the person who had found it necessary to kill him to secure their inheritance. Asterisk. The morning of the third day arrived with an ominous gray sky that seemed to mirror the tension pervading Ashford Manor. Detective Blackwood stood in his room, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence they had gathered. Every statement recorded, every subtle inconsistency noted. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and he suspected it would provide the final piece of the puzzle that had been tormenting him since their pot. Arrival. Eleanor knocked softly on his door, entering with a cup of coffee and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I've been reviewing the financial records Inspector Carter obtained," she said, spreading documents across the small writing desk. "There are some fascinating discrepancies that I think you need to see." Asterisk. The financial documents revealed a complex web of transactions that painted a disturbing picture of the Ashford family's recent history. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from various family accounts over the past 18 months, using a sophisticated network of shell companies and overseas accounts to disguise the theft. "Look at these dates." Eleanor pointed to a series of large withdrawals. "They correspond almost exactly with the times when Vincent was traveling for business. Someone with access to the family finances was using his absences to move significant sums of money." Asterisk. Blackwood studied the patterns, his detective instincts recognizing the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated embezzlement scheme, combined with the art forgeries. "We're looking at a theft operation that has netted someone millions of dollars over the past few years." Vincent's death wasn't just about protecting the secret of the stolen artifacts. It was about concealing a much larger financial conspiracy. The revelation added new dimensions to their understanding of the case. The killer wasn't just someone with knowledge of Asian antiquities. They were also someone with access to the Ashford family's financial accounts and the sophistication to establish international money laundering operations. This narrowed their suspect list considerably, but in ways that made the eventual revelation even more shocking. At precisely 10 o'clock, the family gathered in Vincent's study for the reading of his will. The irony of conducting this solemn ceremony in the very room where Vincent had been murdered was not lost on anyone present. Blackwood and Eleanor positioned themselves discreetly in the back of the room, observing the reactions of each potential beneficiary as Vincent's final wishes were revealed. The family attorney, Harrison Wells, was a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who had served the Ashford family for decades. His voice carried the weight of years as he began to read the document that would determine the distribution of Vincent's considerable fortune. Vincent Charles Ashford, being of sound mind and body, "Do hereby make this my last will and testament, double quotes." The formal language continued as Wells outlined the standard legal provisions, but everyone in the room was waiting for the crucial section that would reveal who stood to inherit Vincent's estate. The initial bequests were relatively modest. Generous provisions for longtime servants like Mrs. Patterson, charitable donations to several museums, and specific artifacts left to institutions that had supported Vincent's collecting activities. But as Wells approached the major distributions, the tension in the room became palpable. "To my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Ashford, I leave the sum of $5 million in the continued right to reside at Ashford Manor for the remainder of her natural life." Margaret's composed facade didn't waver, but Blackwood noticed her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "To my son, David Vincent Ashford, I leave the sum of $10 million in a 50% stake in Ashford Antiquities, with the stipulation that he must work actively in the business for a minimum of 5 years to retain full ownership." David's reaction was more visible, a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. Blackwood filed away the observation for later analysis. "To my brother, Thomas Jonathan Ashford, despite our long estrangement, I leave the sum of $2 million and my personal collection of Ming Dynasty ceramics, in the hope that this gesture might begin to heal the wounds between us." Thomas appeared genuinely surprised by this bequest, his composure slipping for just a moment before he regained control. The gesture suggested that Vincent had been considering reconciliation, despite their bitter history, but it was the next section of the will that provided the most shocking revelation. "To Dr. Helena Morrison, who has been not only my physician but also my most trusted friend and confidant, I leave the sum of $15 million and my complete collection of Asian antiquities, along with the remaining 50% stake in Ashford Antiquities." The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening. Dr. Morrison had become, by far, the primary beneficiary of Vincent's will, inheriting not only a fortune but also control of the very artifacts that had been systematically stolen and replaced with forgeries. Eleanor watched Dr. Morrison's reaction carefully, noting the woman's pale complexion and the way her hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the magnitude of her inheritance. But was this the reaction of someone surprised by unexpected generosity, or someone whose carefully laid plans had just been vindicated? The will reading continued with several minor bequests, but the major revelation had been delivered. Dr. Helena Morrison stood to inherit over $30 million in control of one of the world's finest private collections of Asian antiquities. If she had been systematically stealing and replacing pieces from that very collection, Vincent's death had just made her incredibly wealthy while eliminating the only person who could expose her crimes. But as the family members began to disperse, each processing the implications of Vincent's final wishes, Blackwood noticed something that made him reconsider his assumptions about the case. Dr. Morrison's reaction to her inheritance seemed genuinely shocked, almost distressed rather than triumphant. If she had killed Vincent to protect her theft operation and secure her inheritance, wouldn't she have expected this outcome? The detective's contemplation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Margaret Ashford had collapsed, apparently overcome by the emotional stress of the morning's revelations. Dr. Morrison immediately rushed to her aid, her medical training taking precedence over any other considerations. As Eleanor helped carry Margaret to her bedroom, she noticed something that would prove crucial to their investigation. In Dr. Morrison's medical bag, among the standard supplies, was a small vial of clear liquid labeled in what appeared to be Chinese characters. When she mentioned this observation to Blackwood, his eyes immediately sharpened with interest. "Chinese labeling on a medical supply," he mused. That could be perfectly innocent, traditional. Chinese medicine often uses preparations that would be unfamiliar to Western practitioners. But it could also be something far more sinister, The afternoon brought new revelations as Inspector Carter returned with additional forensic evidence. The analysis of the forged artifacts had revealed something unexpected. The forgeries were exceptional quality, far beyond what most criminal operations could produce. Moreover, they showed characteristics of traditional Chinese craftsmanship techniques that would require years of specialized training to master. We're not dealing with simple criminal forgeries, Carter explained. These are museum-quality reproductions that would fool most experts. Someone with intimate knowledge of traditional Asian art techniques created these pieces. This information cast Dr. Morrison's inheritance in a new light. If she had been creating the forgeries herself, her medical knowledge combined with years studying traditional Chinese techniques during her medical training would provide exactly the expertise required. Moreover, her position as Vincent's trusted friend would have given her unlimited access to his collection and detailed knowledge of his security measures. But as Blackwood pondered these possibilities, Eleanor made a discovery that fundamentally altered their understanding of the case. While examining Vincent's personal correspondence more thoroughly, she found a series of letters that had been carefully hidden beneath other papers in his desk drawer. These letters, dating back over 6 months, revealed a secret that cast everything they thought they knew about the case in an entirely different light. The letters were love letters, passionate, intimate correspondence between Vincent and someone whose identity was initially unclear from the contents. But as Eleanor read further, certain details began to emerge that painted a picture of a romantic relationship that Vincent had been desperately trying to keep secret from his family and business associates. "My dearest," one letter began, "the time we spent together in Shanghai was the happiest of my life. I know we agreed to keep our relationship private until after I could properly arrange my affairs, but the deception is becoming harder to bear each day." Another letter, written more recently, revealed Vincent's growing concerns about his secret relationship. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the collection. I understand your expertise in these matters far exceeds my own, and I value your advice about authentication and preservation. But some of your suggestions about updating certain pieces concern me." The final letter in the hidden collection was dated just 2 weeks before Vincent's death. "I cannot ignore my suspicions any longer. The piece you convinced me to restore last month, I had it examined by an outside expert. It's a forgery and a sophisticated one. We need to discuss this immediately. I pray there's an innocent explanation." As Eleanor shared these revelations with Blackwood, both detectives realized they had uncovered the emotional core of the case. Vincent's murder wasn't just about money or artifacts. It was about a profound personal betrayal by someone he loved. The thief had been systematically replacing pieces in his collection, not despite their romantic relationship, but because of it, the expertise, the access, the intimate knowledge of what would hurt him most. Blackwood summarized grimly. "We're looking for someone who was not only stealing from Vincent's collection, but also manipulating his emotions to facilitate the theft." Identifying Vincent's secret lover from the letters proved challenging. The correspondence was carefully worded to avoid specific identifying details, suggesting that both parties were aware of the need for discretion. However, certain references began to paint a picture of someone with medical knowledge, extensive travel experience in Asia, and deep familiarity with the Ashford family. Dynamics. The breakthrough came when Eleanor discovered a small notation in Vincent's personal calendar, a series of appointments marked only with the letter H and scheduled for times when the rest of the family would be away from the manor. The pattern of these meetings corresponded exactly with the dates when artifacts had gone missing from the collection. H. Blackwood repeated thoughtfully. "Helena Morrison." The meetings, the expertise, the access, everything points to Dr. Morrison as both Vincent's secret lover and his killer. But even as the evidence seemed to align, something nagged at Blackwood's detective instincts. The case felt almost too neat, too perfectly arranged. In his experience, the most elaborate deceptions often contained hidden layers designed to protect the real perpetrator by implicating someone else. As evening approached, the household prepared for what everyone sensed would be the final act of the drama that had begun with Vincent's mysterious death. Blackwood announced that he would present his conclusions to the assembled group the following morning, giving the killer one last night to contemplate their crimes. But that night brought unexpected developments that would change everything. Eleanor, unable to sleep, decided to examine Vincent's study once more, hoping to find any overlooked clues that might confirm or refute their suspicions about Dr. Morrison. What she discovered in that final search would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire mystery. Hidden in a false bottom of Vincent's desk drawer was a small recording device that had been activated by a hidden switch. The device contained the complete recording of Vincent's final confrontation with his killer, including the voice of the murderer that had been missing from the previous recording they had found. As Eleanor played the recording in the darkness of Vincent's study, the truth about his death finally emerged. The voice of his killer was clear and distinct, revealing not only their identity but also the full scope of their deception. The revelation was so shocking that Eleanor gasped aloud, immediately understanding why Vincent had felt so profoundly betrayed. The killer was not who they had suspected. In fact, the entire investigation had been carefully manipulated to point suspicion toward innocent parties, while the real murderer remained hidden in plain sight. The sophistication of the deception was breathtaking in its audacity and psychological cunning. As Eleanor rushed to wake Blackwood and share her discovery, she realized that the case of Vincent Ashford's murder was about to reveal depths of betrayal and calculated evil that surpassed anything they had encountered in their previous investigations. The final confrontation would take place at dawn, and when it did, everyone at Ashford Manor would learn that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most harmless. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ashford Manor as Detective Blackwood prepared for the most challenging revelation of his career. Eleanor's discovery of the complete recording had fundamentally altered their understanding of the case, revealing a deception so sophisticated that it had successfully misdirected their entire investigation. Now, as the household gathered in the main drawing room at Blackwood's request, the truth was finally ready to emerge. The assembly was complete. Margaret Ashford sat rigidly in her customary chair, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. David paced near the windows, his nervous energy barely contained. Thomas had positioned himself apart from the others, his expression unreadable. Dr. Helena Morrison sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, while James Crawford occupied a chair near the fireplace, his businesslike demeanor intact even in these extraordinary circumstances. Inspector Carter stood near the door, ready to act when the killer was finally identified. Blackwood stood before the gathered group, his sharp eyes taking in each face, searching for the subtle signs that would confirm what the recording had revealed. Eleanor sat nearby with her notebook, ready to document the final chapter of their investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most respected detectives of his generation, "we have gathered here to resolve the mystery of Vincent Ashford's death. Over the past 3 days, we have uncovered evidence of systematic theft, elaborate forgery operations, financial embezzlement, and ultimately, cold-blooded murder. But the truth, as we shall see, is far more complex and disturbing than any of us initially suspected." He moved to stand behind Vincent's desk, the very spot where the victim had been found. Vincent Ashford was murdered by someone he trusted implicitly, someone who had been systematically betraying that trust for years while maintaining a facade of loyalty and affection. The killer used aconitine derived from wolfsbane, administered after Vincent had been sedated, to ensure he couldn't resist or call for help. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Dr. Morrison's face had grown pale. David stopped his pacing, and Thomas leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged. The motive, Blackwood continued, appeared initially to be the theft of valuable artifacts from Vincent's collection. Indeed, our investigation revealed that over $2 million worth of pieces had been systematically replaced with sophisticated forgeries over a period of several years. But this theft was merely one component of a much larger criminal enterprise. Eleanor consulted her notes and added, "Our financial analysis revealed that someone had also been embezzling funds from the Ashford family accounts, using shell companies and overseas transfers to hide the theft of additional millions of dollars. The killer," Blackwood said, his voice growing harder, "combined intimate knowledge of Vincent's collection with access to his financial accounts and the sophistication to create museum-quality forgeries. They used their position of trust to commit these crimes over an extended period, always careful to avoid detection." James Crawford cleared his throat. "Detective, surely you're not suggesting that one of us—" "I'm not suggesting, Mr. Crawford. I'm stating facts based on irrefutable evidence." Blackwood's interruption was sharp. "The killer is indeed among us, and they have been listening to our investigation with considerable interest, probably hoping to determine how much we have discovered." The tension in the room was palpable, as each person glanced suspiciously at the others. Blackwood let the moment stretch, observing their reactions carefully. Our initial investigation naturally focused on those with the expertise to create sophisticated forgeries of Asian antiquities. Dr. Morrison, with her years of study in China, seemed a logical suspect. Thomas Ashford's doctorate in art history made him another possibility. Even James Crawford's connections in the Asian art market raised questions about his involvement. Dr. Morrison spoke for the first time. "Detective, I want you to know that despite my inheritance from Vincent's will—" "I had no idea, Dr. Morrison," Blackwood interrupted gently. "You are not the killer. In fact, you have been as much a victim of this elaborate deception as Vincent himself." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as everyone processed this unexpected development. "If not Dr. Morrison, then who?" "You see," Blackwood continued, moving away from the desk to address the group more directly, "the killer has been extraordinarily clever in their planning. They not only committed their crimes, but also created an elaborate framework to deflect suspicion onto others. The threatening letters were carefully crafted to implicate Thomas Ashford. The timing of the thefts was arranged to suggest Dr. Morrison's involvement. Even the method of murder was chosen partly to point suspicion toward someone with medical knowledge." Eleanor stood and moved to a position where she could observe all the suspects more clearly. "The breakthrough came when we discovered the complete recording of Vincent's final confrontation with his killer. Unlike the partial recording we found initially, this one captured the killer's voice clearly." "And whose voice was it?" Thomas asked, his composure finally showing cracks. Blackwood smiled grimly. "Someone whose involvement we never seriously considered because they appeared to be genuinely grieving Vincent's death. Someone who had both the access and expertise necessary for these crimes, but who had successfully deflected suspicion by appearing to cooperate fully with our investigation." The detective's gaze swept across the room before settling on his target. The voice belonged to Margaret Ashford. The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute. Margaret sat perfectly still, her composure intact, but Eleanor noticed that her hands had clenched into fists. "That's impossible," David stammered. "My mother would never—" "Your mother," Blackwood continued relentlessly, "has been systematically looting your father's collection and embezzling from his accounts for over 5 years. She used her position as his wife to gain unrestricted access to both his artifacts and his financial records. Her frequent travels to visit friends were actually trips to establish the international Connections necessary to fence stolen artwork. Margaret finally spoke, her voice as controlled as ever. This is preposterous. You have no evidence. We have extensive evidence, Eleanor interjected, consulting her notebook. Financial records showing that the embezzlement occurred during periods when you were supposedly traveling for pleasure. Expert analysis proving that the forgeries were created using techniques you learned during your art history studies at university, studies that specialized in Asian antiquities. Authentication. Blackwood moved closer to Margaret, his voice growing more forceful. But most damning of all, we have your own voice on the recording Vincent made of your final confrontation. Shall I play it for everyone to hear? For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Vincent was becoming suspicious, she said quietly. He was going to ruin everything. So you decided to kill him, Blackwood stated flatly. Margaret's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Vincent had everything, the money, the collection, the respect. I was merely his wife, expected to be grateful for his generosity. But I built that collection as much as he did. I researched the pieces, I authenticated them, I established the relationships with dealers. Yet legally, everything belonged to him. So you decided to take what you felt was rightfully yours. Eleanor said, I took what I had earned, Margaret replied with bitter dignity. For 35 years, I played the role of the dutiful wife while Vincent received all the credit for our joint achievements. The collection would have been broken up and sold after his death anyway. I was simply ensuring that I received fair compensation for my contributions. David looked at his mother with horror. You killed father for money? Margaret's laugh was harsh. I killed him because he was going to destroy me. He discovered what I had been doing and threatened to have me arrested. After everything I had done for him, for this family, he was willing to see me imprisoned rather than quietly arrange a divorce that would have given me a fair settlement. The love letters, Blackwood said suddenly. Vincent wasn't having an affair at all. He was trying to reconcile with you, wasn't he? The letters were his attempts to rekindle your marriage after he discovered your betrayal. Margaret's expression grew even colder. Vincent's sentimental weakness made him predictable. He wanted to work things out, to find a way to keep the family together. But I knew that his discovery of my activities meant that reconciliation was impossible. He would never have been able to forgive what he saw as my betrayal. So you manipulated his emotions to gain access to his study for the final time, Eleanor concluded. You arranged to meet him there under the pretense of discussing reconciliation, but instead, you administered the sedative and then the fatal dose of aconitine. The wolfsbane was easy to obtain, Margaret admitted with clinical detachment. I had been growing it in the manor's garden for years. Vincent never paid attention to my botanical interests. Inspector Carter stepped forward with handcuffs as Margaret continued her confession. With the same cold precision she had applied to her crimes, I had been planning Vincent's death for months, waiting for the right opportunity. The auction provided perfect cover. So many people in the house, so many distractions. I knew that suspicion would fall on others, particularly Dr. Morrison, given her inheritance. I never expected you to discover the complete recording. Why did Vincent make that recording? James Crawford asked, his voice hollow with shock. Margaret's smile was bitter. Vincent was always thorough in his record-keeping. When he confronted me about the thefts, he wanted documentation of my confession for legal purposes. He thought he could use it to force me to make restitution quietly, avoiding the scandal of a public trial. But you had already decided that Vincent had to die. Blackwood said, I had no choice, Margaret replied without emotion. Vincent's discovery threatened everything I had worked for. The money I had taken was already invested in properties and accounts that he could never have traced. His death would have made me wealthy enough to live comfortably anywhere in the world. Instead, You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, Inspector Carter said as he placed the handcuffs on Margaret's wrists. As Margaret was led away, her composure finally completely shattered. "You don't understand," she called back to her son. "Everything I did was to secure our family's future." Vincent would have lost everything to his sentimental attachment to objects and institutions that cared nothing for him personally. David stood frozen, unable to process the destruction of everything he had believed about his family. Dr. Morrison moved to comfort him, her medical instincts overriding the shock of the revelations. Thomas sat heavily in his chair, overwhelmed by the realization that his estranged brother had been reaching out to him even in his final days. "James." Crawford approached Blackwood as the detective gathered his notes. "How did you know it was Margaret?" Even with the recording, the evidence against Dr. Morrison seemed so compelling. Blackwood smiled wearily. "Several things troubled me about the case from the beginning. The sophistication of the deception suggested someone with intimate knowledge of how investigations proceed. Margaret had been watching our progress closely, subtly steering us toward suspects she had already prepared to take that blame. But the expertise required for the forgeries, Margaret's art history background was more extensive than anyone realized," Eleanor explained. "She had been the real expert in the family all along, but Vincent received credit for their joint collecting activities. Her resentment over this lack of recognition provided additional motivation for her crimes. As the household slowly dispersed, each member trying to process the shocking revelations, Blackwood reflected on the case that had tested even his considerable deductive abilities. Margaret Ashford had committed the perfect crime in every respect except one. Her need to completely control the narrative of Vincent's death had led her to create evidence that ultimately exposed her guilt. The sun finally broke through the gray clouds as Blackwood and Eleanor prepared to leave Ashford Manor. Justice had been served, but at a terrible cost to the family that would have to rebuild their lives in the shadow of betrayal and murder. Vincent Ashford's death had been solved, but the psychological damage inflicted by Margaret's elaborate deception would resonate through the lives of everyone she had touched for years to come.